Hello everyone, and welcome to the third installment in this series on Ozone 7's vintage modules. I'm Jake Perrine, and now we're going to look at the vintage tape module. Of course, analog tape has long been sought after for its saturation properties, and the years of making records using analog tape as a multi-track format produced some of the greatest rock and roll records even to this day. And I think part of the pleasing sound of that era had a lot to do with the fact that they were being recorded to this analog tape. Yet even today, some musicians are either still seeking to use analog tape as their format, or at least print their masters down to 2-track analog tape, thereby running the entire mix through a tape saturation. And the inclusion of a tape module inside of Ozone 7 here, I think, is really trying to give you access to a bit of that sound. What tape does is to saturate signals of a higher amplitude more and more, meaning as you drive more and more signal into it, you get not the harsh digital distortion that you're used to hearing in DAWs, but rather a rich, harmonically driven saturation more akin to a guitar amplifier being overdriven or an analog circuit being maxed out. So the controls here are really focusing on distortion characteristics. And a little bit goes a long way. I think of tape saturation as sort of the butter that you spread on top of a signal, an entire mix even, if it requires that, to give it a little bit of richness. So we can drive the signal more or less with the input. We have a bias control that's going to skew the frequency spectrum slightly, adding more distortion to the high end or the low end, respectively. The speed control emulates the rate at which our imaginary vintage tape machine is running, either at 30 inches per second or 15 inches per second. These old tape machines had speed switches on them that allowed you to change the rate at which you were recording and playing back. And 30 inches per second gives a higher fidelity signal that has more high end in it. And 15 inches per second is not just an economy setting that would use less tape, but also really warm up the lows and not have quite so harsh a high end in it. So it's really just a toggle between those two characteristics. Then you can dial in the amount of harmonics that are being added by saturating this imaginary tape. And then finally, kind of an EQ control that allows you to emphasize more of the low frequencies or the high frequencies, because the bias control, the speed, and the harmonics are all doing tonality shifts, and this will allow you to dial in exactly how much high-end distortion and how much low-end distortion you'd like to hear. So let's check this out. I'm going to give you some extreme settings, and then we'll dial in something that's maybe a little more pleasing for this loop. There you go. That's pretty nice. You'll notice that when we drive this all the way up to the top, we get a sort of square wave distortion that's maybe wonderful for some dubstep and hard house and those kinds of things. Bringing that down a little bit, we get into a little bit more of a sine wave shape distortion, and that brings out that low mids really nicely, I thought. Up here, we're doing more of the high mids and high end. We get more distortion in that range, and I think that range sounds pretty good already. The amount of harmonics that we're going to add, we can get away with quite a bit in this. It gives that low end some nice crunchy warmth that I think it definitely needs. And then the high emphasis allows us to bring back a little bit of life into that upper mids and high end, the rim shot, the snare, the hi-hats, the little twinkly piano, electric piano that's in there. Overall, this module really breathes some new life into flat sounding sounds. So if you have a bass sound or a guitar that needs a little bit of life to it, it feels just kind of dead and flat, this is a wonderful module for doing that sort of thing. Of course, the multi-band exciter can do a similar job in a frequency-specific way. I really like this vintage tape module for its overall addition to a mix, or in this case, a sample that has a full spectrum going on. Stay tuned as we get into our final module, the vintage limiter.